In this video, what I want to talk about today in working with men is it's really quite common how when men come in to see me and work in their own inner journey work, they present a lot with stress. Life's just getting too hard. And I think as men, we've missed the boat. I was just joking, we haven't really missed the boat, but in terms of our emotional health, we've elected to, from our social conditioning, decided to move into the intellectual brain at the behest of the emotional brain. And the emotional brain and the intellectual brain, the cognitive brain, speak a different language. Yes, we use CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy, to try to men to help change the thinking, change the feelings, look at the pros and cons of their behaviour. But a lot of times when they come in to see me, they're overloaded with stress. And I think it really helps with men to use an alternative to what's going on through their thinking brain. And one of those techniques that I've found that really helps identify with this is symbols and sound play work. It's I know when people come into this office, they want, wow, look at all these toys. Yes, they are toys, but it's a symbols and sound play therapy technique. There's a sound tray at the moment just sitting at the desk, giving a demonstration of the main areas that I do a lot of work with men. As men, I generally use this symbol here. This is our ego self. We all present the ego to the world, and put it down as that smooth-looking dude. And in our society, that we need to succeed. And I think for men, what happens is when we have families, something in our primitive brain switches and it says, oh my God, I'm now a provider and I've got to put food on the table for my partner, wife, and 2 or 3 kids. And that's something shifts for men. And with the ethos in our economic society today, we're now working 10 to 12 hour days. There is economic abundance and economic affluence, but what's it costing our emotional and mental health? And for men, because we've been taught over the years to shut down the emotional brain, close off the heart, we close it off by taking on stress, workplace stresses of the family, just the global stuff. And a lot of times when guys come in to see me, they actually say they feel like this. They feel like shit. And sometimes how I present this, and hopefully it becomes clear in the video, is that sometimes when we're feeling like shit, it's like our egoic self has got its nose face planted in the shit. We feel like shit. Life is shit. I'm saying life is shit. And because we are conditioned to not fail, and we've got to be successful, and we've got a strong inner critic, it's like I use this angry symbol, this internalized anger that really beats the shit out of men. It absolutely fucking canes them. You're never good enough. It's the, I call when our nose is face planted in this shit, I call it the shit and shame. At the shit and shame, when we're in that shit and shame, it's like we're just stuck in it. We're caught in it. We can't. It's really hard to break the thinking and the mold. Yes, we get out of bed, and it's like I say to guys, it's like getting out of bed. It's like going out to the backyard to kickstart the Harley Davidson, but you can't electronically start. You've got to kickstart, and it eventually rolls over and starts purling along, and you get into the work zone, and off to work you go. But when you come home, you leave the workspace, but you're still carrying this feeling like shit around, and it's really hard to have clear thinking, have positive thinking and positive thoughts. And I think when men get caught up, they really do, and I'm sorry to look away, but they really do get caught up in this really dynamic, this really harsh dynamic of Canaan, being really critical of themselves. They're really harsh on themselves, they're loaded with stress, there's no time out. Very, very often they might have hobbies, or they've given their hobbies up. By this stage, a lot of this frustration may have come out through white line fever on a sporting pitch. But now, in their late 30s, early 30s, late 40s, where does that energy go? And when they're loaded with this stress, I wonder what impact that stress, feeling like shit, loaded with stress, loaded with this internal frustration, this internalized anger. They know they're not allowed to express this anger at their kids or their partners, however it does boil over, and yes, they use it to react inappropriately, perhaps to have power and control over the situation, to stop the extra stress coming towards them, which is not appropriate. But how do they then connect to any sense of happiness within themselves? How do they connect with themselves? When they're loaded up with this stress and internal frustration, where's the connection to their partners? Where's their connection to the children? It's like what's in the psyche is just stress and internal frustration, and there is no room, or they don't allow any room for any happiness, loving kindness, or compassion to particularly be given to themselves. And this is something that I really think it's an epidemic in men. I see it. Maybe I have a skewed view of who comes in this room, but it is an epidemic in men's behaviour, internal behaviour, not just externally to others in the world, to partners and children, but to themselves. It is epidemic, and it is impacting on their mental health. To be loaded with the stress, but then to add extra stress by this internalized anger pressure is just absolute. It's just bullshit what we do to ourselves. And when I start asking men about, well, what do you do to care for this part of yourself that's fallen over? We're not going to cope. We all don't cope, and when we're not coping, of course we're going to be vulnerable. We're going to be, I call it the delicate little Vegemite, the fragile part of ourselves that is not designed. The fragile part of ourselves is just not designed to cope in this. It needs our care, and we've still got that aspect of ourselves in our psyche. And so what I try to do is to help men to sort of, hey, how do you stop? Just to identify this dynamic, this inherent dynamic that you've got in your psyche. How do you stop? How do you take a time out? How do you look after yourself? How often do you stop? How often do you reflect on all the stress that you're carrying? What's that stress like in your body? How much tension have you got in your body? How do you relax? How do you switch off? And I think a lot of the switching off is the sound of the opening of the stubby, and again, that's also problematic because it can become habitual. In the sessions, it's about, by putting this down, by visualizing this. I use it quite a lot with men. Always these three symbols that you can see here are the three that I use a lot. That's speaking volumes about where men are at in terms of their own well-being. And when it all gets too much, the emotional pain, the trauma inside is just horrendous. And they're not helping the trauma, they're just putting more and more pressure on themselves. And when that pressure gets too much, they just get so overwhelmed and just break down. And unfortunately, when there's so much emotional pain, some men get what I'd call the fuckers. They just give up, just shut down. Nothing gets in, nothing gets out. And this can be a really dangerous period, because if people can't be reached in there, that's when men do really serious things to themselves and others. And so by identifying this epidemic here, feeling like shit, yes, sometimes, it's, as Freud, I think it was, that said the ego is the false ego. You know, when that gets nose planted, you know, okay, we're not going to cope. But it's not a failure if we're not coping. You know, instead of critiquing it really harshly and internalizing, adding to the stress, how can we stop and bring some loving kindness, bring some compassion and some self-care to this process? And that's what I try to work with in men, is to start developing new wirings in our minds and in our psyches about, hey, loving kindness, having some compassion, and when we're not coping. How do we learn to cope? How do we learn to give some nourishment and to nurture the wound or the overwhelmed part in ourselves? And when we're stressed, you know, we're disconnecting, we're caught up in the stress, we're disconnecting to those that we love. And the most important thing we need is care and compassion, self-love, connection to self. And hopefully by the use of these symbols can help men start to identify. And yes, we do then, as sessions go on, we start looking for an empowered side of themselves. I hope you got something from this video, this short clip. Yep, 3 symbols. It is an epidemic, and we men need to start working at changing.